My name is Samara Collins. I'm 30 years old, currently living and working as a lawyer in Chicago. From the outside, my life may look picture perfect. A house of my own, a stable career, no family baggage. But 2 weeks ago, in the middle of the night, I got a phone call from a hospital. A man had just been in a serious accident and was barely conscious. He asked for me, calling me daughter. That man was my biological father, the one who left me at a desolate gas station when I was just 9 years old, then vanished without a single goodbye. Have you ever been discarded by the very person who brought you into this world, like something no longer useful? If you've ever felt betrayed by those who were supposed to love you the most, share your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to this channel so we can expose the truth they tried to bury, because what happened after that call was far more bitter. I remember that day vividly. The sky was overcast, and the wind was so cold it made your bones ache, even though it was midsummer. I was just 9, curled up in the back seat of our beat-up minivan, clutching my worn-out, blonde-haired doll that had been tugged and pulled too many times. In the front, my father and my stepmother were arguing nonstop, their voices drowning out the soft hum of classical music on the radio. I didn't understand every word, but I caught bits like debt, enough, and I can't take this anymore. I'd grown used to their fights. Ever since Deborah moved in just a few months after my real mother died of a stroke, our house had never known peace. Deborah never once looked at me as a child worthy of care. Whenever my father wasn't around, she'd glare at me like I was a burden, a constant reminder of a life she never wanted. That day was supposed to be a simple road trip to visit my aunt in the neighboring state. I sat quietly in the back, my stomach aching from missing lunch, while Deborah kept grumbling about money, complaining she was tired of raising a child that wasn't hers. My father said nothing. He gripped the steering wheel and stared ahead, silent, in a way that felt unfamiliar. Around noon, the car pulled into a gas station along a deserted highway. There wasn't even a convenience store, just a tiny shack selling drinks and snacks, standing beside a rusted fuel pump. My father turned toward me, his voice low but calm. "Go grab a bottle of water for me, sweetheart." I nodded and got out, still holding my doll. I ran into the shack, picked the coldest bottle I could find, and came out with a small smile, proud I'd helped him somehow. But when the door swung shut behind me, what I saw was nothing. The car was gone, no engine noise, no trail of dust, no shout calling me back. They left as if I never existed. I stood frozen under the glaring sun, my small hand still holding the bottle of water. I looked around, thinking maybe I'd made a mistake, but the long road ahead was empty. Fear crept in. My legs trembled. I fought back tears, just standing there, waiting, hoping they would come back. It took over 30 minutes before an older man in a blue jumpsuit, probably the station attendant, walked over to me. His face was lined with concern. "Sweetheart, who are you here with?" he asked gently, kneeling to meet my eyes. "My dad told me to get him water, then he disappeared," I whispered, my throat tightening like every word was a stone. He led me into the shack, gave me a chair, and handed me a glass of orange juice. He made a phone call while keeping an eye on me through the window. His voice lowered, but I could still hear him clearly. "A little girl's been left here. About 9 years old. No guardian in sight." The police arrived nearly an hour later. I'd never seen so many uniforms at once. They asked questions, wrote things down, and one female officer wrapped her arm around my shoulder, guiding me to the squad car. They said they'd try contacting my parents. I nodded, but deep down, I already knew no one was coming back. 2 days later, in the intake room of the precinct, I met my grandmother, my father's mother. She walked in with neatly pinned white hair, eyes full of worry, and arms wide open. I ran into her hug. I didn't feel invisible. She cried as she stroked my tangled hair with trembling hands. "My poor girl, how could anyone leave you alone like this?" she said angrily to the officer. "I'll handle everything. She's coming home with me." From that day forward, my grandmother officially became my guardian. I never knew how she managed to win the legal battle, only that she kept going in and out of offices with stacks of papers. I once overheard her on the phone saying, "I won't let her live with people who abandon their own blood. I'd sell my house before letting her go back there." The years that followed, I grew up in her modest home in the suburbs of Chicago. We didn't have much, but we had peace, and I had safety. Every night, she told me stories about her youth, how she survived war and heartbreak. She'd say, "You're strong, Samara, but you don't have to be strong alone." She taught me how to tell the difference between real kindness and performative regret. She also told me forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means you no longer let them control you. I grew up wrapped in the love of the only person who truly cared whether I existed. Still, I often dreamed of that afternoon. An old gas station, a cold bottle of water, and a car vanishing behind a line of trees. Not because I couldn't forget, but because some wounds never heal. I was raised on the scent of fresh pastries from our kitchen and the sound of my grandmother's knitting needles clicking beside the window on winter nights, the warm glow of a table lamp lighting up the blanket she never finished. She never spoke much about the past, never blamed her son in front of me, but I could feel the pain and disappointment behind every soft-spoken word. In that little house, she rebuilt a world where I was allowed to exist, to be loved, to be believed in. Every day after school, I helped her clean, then sat at the small desk by the window to study. She always placed a cup of chamomile tea and a cookie next to me. When I frowned at math problems or quietly wiped ink smudges from my paper, she'd say, "You don't have to be the best. Just try your best." I didn't have many friends. The kids in the neighborhood had parents to pick them up, complete homes with full families. I only had her, an aging woman trying to carry the weight of both time and responsibility. But I never felt lonely. She was my anchor whenever the world felt too wide or too cold. By the time I entered high school, I realized I was different, not just because I didn't have parents, but because I studied harder, stayed quieter, and carried myself differently. Teachers loved me because I was diligent, classmates respected me for always scoring high, and all I ever wanted was from my grandmother not to worry. Once, I brought home an invitation to a city-wide speech competition. She hugged me tight, her voice trembling with pride. "You're brave enough to speak your truth in front of strangers. I'm so proud of you." When I looked into her eyes, I saw them sparkle. The look of someone who knew she'd been right to fight for me. I got into Northwestern University's law program on a full scholarship. When the official letter arrived, I brought it home to show her. She held it in both hands, read it 5 times, then sat in silence for a long while. I thought she was too emotional to speak, but then she smiled and placed her hand on her heart. "I used to worry I wouldn't live long enough to raise you, but you've grown wings." I moved into the dorms, taking with me a small box of photos, an old storybook she used to read to me, and a handwritten card she had secretly slipped into my suitcase. "When you feel tired, remember, you're not alone." College wasn't easy. Legal readings that went on for hundreds of pages, sleepless nights filled with case reviews, and fierce debates with classmates tested every part of me. But I always thought of her, the little kitchen where I once studied, the silver strands of her hair catching the morning light as she waved goodbye from the doorway. I graduated at the top of my class with perfect grades and a thesis published in a law journal. On graduation day, my grandmother, leaning on her cane, came to the ceremony and sat in the front row, dressed in an old but carefully ironed pale blue dress. When my name was called, I saw her rise, her hands shaking as she clapped. Maybe even she couldn't believe the little girl once left behind had made it to that stage. That night, as I drove her home, she sat at the kitchen table, holding a cup of tea but not drinking. She looked at me, her voice steady and warm. "I won't live forever, but I know you'll live a life of decency, not to get revenge, but to make sure you never become the person you once feared." I nodded, eyes burning. She didn't mention my father, nor Deborah, but in that moment, a silent promise settled into me. I would never look for them. I didn't need answers for why they did what they did. I didn't need apologies that came too late. Because I was no longer the little girl standing at a gas station trembling with a bottle of water in her hand. I was Samara Collins, I didn't need them to prove I mattered, and I would live in a way that made sure my name never needed to be tied to anyone else's but my own. And so, I stepped into the world carrying the last lesson my grandmother had ever taught me. No one can take away your dignity unless you give it up yourself. The day Grandma passed, it rained. Not hard, but steady, like the sky itself was bowing in farewell. The funeral was simple, just as she had wanted. No flashy flower arrangements, no long-winded speeches. Only a soft violin melody floated through the small cemetery on the city's west side. I wore the black dress she had sewn for my graduation and stood silently beside her casket, clutching the gray wool scarf she had rushed to finish before she left this world. After the service, I began cleaning the two-bedroom home we had shared for over 20 years. Everything remained exactly as she'd left it. The porcelain dishes with faded floral trim, the jar of orange marmalade she made last winter, the antique alarm clock that ticked every morning. I moved through each room as if she were still there, just out for groceries and had forgotten to leave a note. That evening, our family lawyer, Mr. McAllister, called me. His voice was as steady and cautious as always. "Samara, I need to meet with you about your grandmother's will," he said. "There are a few things you should know." I went to his office the next morning, carrying her little notebook and the blue fountain pen I always use for important signatures. Mr. McAllister opened an old file and pushed it toward me. "Your grandmother left all of her assets to you," he began, "including the house, savings, and personal belongings. But there's a special clause. The house title is still jointly owned between you and your biological father, Jacob Collins." I froze. That name hit like a rusted blade slicing through my memory. Jacob Collins. I thought it had long been erased from every document, every memory, every legal trace in my life. "You mean my father?" I asked, though I had heard him clearly. He nodded and slid another document copy toward me. "When you were little, your grandmother gained legal guardianship, but for various reasons the house remained co-owned by her and Jacob. They had purchased it together in 1996. She'd tried to transfer full ownership to you after he left, but the process was stalled because he never signed off." I held the papers, eyes scanning the short black lines, a lump forming in my throat. That man was still alive, and now he legally owned part of the home I had lived in all my life. "Does he know Grandma passed?" I asked, my voice low, fury creeping beneath the surface. "Yes. I sent the letter myself," McAllister said. "He responded. He's coming to Chicago this week to discuss the property transfer." I didn't say a word. Part of me wanted to walk out, toss the papers in the trash, and pretend this was a cruel prank. But the other part, the lawyer forged in years of discipline and control, knew I had to face this. That night, I sat alone in the familiar kitchen where Grandma used to cook chicken soup whenever I felt sick. I placed the deed on the table and stared at the name, Jacob Collins, printed in bold right next to mine. The man who had abandoned me without a single call, without a shred of apology. And now, after all this silence, he was back, as if nothing had happened. I remembered something Grandma once told me during a rainy afternoon. If the past ever knocks on your door, you have to be strong enough to face it, not turn away. I had nodded then, thinking she was talking about love or career setbacks. Now I understood. She was talking about this man. I flipped through the will again and paused at her handwritten note at the end. "My dearest Samara, if you're reading this, then you're old enough to understand that not everything deserves forgiveness, but still must be addressed. Do what's right, as you always have." I straightened up and closed the folder. I was no longer that little girl left behind. I was a woman, ready to face the return of her past, even if it wore the face of the man I once called father. That afternoon, the sky was overcast again, early autumn winds tapping the kitchen window. I had just poured a pot of Earl Grey tea when the doorbell rang. It wasn't rushed or hesitant, just a long, steady ring. I knew it was them. I opened the door. Jacob Collins stood on the porch, his hair now graying, wearing a faded brown jacket, hands in his pockets like he was dropping by an old friend. Beside him stood Deborah, the woman who turned my childhood cold. Her makeup still flawless, but the ice in her gaze hadn't melted. Samara, he spoke first, trying to soften his voice with a nervous smile. You've grown. I didn't reply. I stepped aside and opened the door wider. I didn't greet them. I didn't welcome them. But I wanted them inside so I could see every expression, every rehearsed line they were about to deliver inside the home I had guarded with every ounce of love Grandma left me. They sat on the living room couch. Jacob glanced around, nodding to himself. This place, it hasn't changed. Your grandmother, she always knew how to keep things in order. I sat across from them, set my teacup on the table without touching it. Deborah's eyes swept across the bookshelf, the framed photos, stopping on the silver frame that held the picture of me and Grandma. She didn't speak, just curled her lips as if swallowing a snide remark. We'd like to talk, Jacob said, placing his hands on his knees like he was in a therapy session. I nodded. He drew a breath, eyes cast down. We know our presence today might be unsettling, but we didn't have a choice. Deborah leaned in, her voice sweet and slick as honey over gravel. We truly regret what happened. Back then, we weren't mature enough. We didn't have the means to raise you. But look at you now, strong, successful. We're so proud. I tilted my head slightly, studying her, every word polished, practiced. But those eyes, they were still the same. The ones that used to look at me like I was a burden. Jacob continued. We're not here to make demands, Samara, but we're in serious trouble. The company's gone under. The bank foreclosed our home. We have nowhere to go. We thought maybe you could help. I stayed silent. Deborah leaned forward, placing her hand on the table. We just need a place to stay for a while. Nothing more. Just one chance to start over. We're family, Samara. I laughed softly. Not bitterly. Just a quiet reflex in response to how polished she still was in playing the victim. I thought you had your own house, I said, eyes locked on hers. Or is it no longer in your name? She hesitated, then wet her lips. Well, we co-signed a loan for Deborah's son, and I don't need the details, I cut her off, voice calm but firm. Jacob winced, his hands clasping tighter. We don't want to create conflict. But legally, I still own part of this house. Maybe we can cohabitate just for a little while, and then I stood up. They looked at me, thinking I was about to agree. But I only walked to the front door, opened it wide. The evening wind swept in, carrying the scent of damp grass and leftover rain. I think this conversation should end here. Deborah was the first to stand up, saying nothing more, just pressing her lips together. Jacob hesitated, reaching out to put his hand on my shoulder, but I stepped back half a step. That distance was enough for him to understand. I truly am sorry, he whispered, eyes lowered. I said nothing. They quietly stepped outside, their figures slowly disappearing behind the white wooden fence. When the door closed behind them, I didn't feel relief or anger, just an extended silence filled with emptiness. I returned to the table, the teacup still warm. I lifted it, took a sip, tasting bitterness that touched my tongue and spread, much like what had just unfolded in the living room. The trick may be new, but the players are old, and this time I would no longer be the child waiting for them to turn back. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because the encounter with Jacob and Deborah made me angry or regretful, but because of a strange feeling scratching lightly at my chest, as if there was something unresolved, something my grandmother had kept hidden that I was only now beginning to sense. I got out of bed, quietly went downstairs, and opened the old filing cabinet where she kept important papers. This oak cabinet had been with her for decades, its paint peeling, the lock a little stiff, but I still remembered the way to tap twice lightly on the drawer edge to make it pop open. I pulled out a thick folder, carefully tied with a silver ribbon. On the top, her handwriting in purple ink read, "Private files. Do not open unless necessary." I sat down at the dining table. The The soft yellow light from an antique lamp was gentle enough not to glare, but still illuminated every number and line clearly. I untied the ribbon and opened the folder. The first document was a copy of a tuition loan contract, clearly dated September 1998. Borrower, Jacob Edward Collins. School, Illinois State University. Loan amount, $42,000. Paid by Margaret Rose Collins, my grandmother. At the bottom was Jacob's familiar scrawled signature, next to the words, "I commit to repay the full loan within 5 years." I sat silently. That year, I was just born, meaning while I was still babbling my first words, she was already shouldering the burden of paying tuition for her own son, who would later abandon his daughter at a gas station by the highway. I flipped through other pages, letters between her and the university, confirmation of installment payments, bank transfer receipts from a small neighborhood bank. Each page was a knife cutting deeper into the fragile trust I still held about Jacob. That at least he had tried, had some responsibility. But no. Everything she did was to give her son a chance, while he never knew how to repay. I kept flipping until I found a stack of older, yellowed documents. The heading was italicized, "Petition for Custody of Minor, Samara Collins." I froze. This was what she never told me. I read every page, every line. She filed this petition with Cook County Family Court in April 2004, right after finding me abandoned. In the petition, she wrote, "I have good reason to believe my granddaughter is abandoned and at risk of physical and mental harm if she continues to live with her biological father and stepmother." Attached evidence included a copy of the police report, photos from the gas station, and statements from the store employees that day. I kept flipping and found handwritten reports where she detailed every abnormal behavior of Jacob and Deborah during her communications with them. And then, at the end of the file, there was a counter lawsuit filed by Jacob Collins. Reason: deliberately fabricating and defaming the legal guardian's reputation with intent to unlawfully seize joint property. The current house. I leaned back in my chair, heart suddenly heavy. It turned out that day, Jacob not only abandoned me, but also sued his own mother, accusing her of luring a minor to unlawfully seize the house, the very home she had bought, lived in, and raised him. I flipped to the last page, a court ruling, custody awarded to Margaret Collins, the counterclaim dismissed due to lack of grounds. In red pen, probably hers, a note: "Won the case, but never won the heart of a child once abandoned." I cried. For the first time in many years, I let my tears flow freely, not because I was hurt, but because I understood the silence she carried all those years. She never told me she had been sued by her own son. She never said she had to fight to prove I deserved protection. She simply raised me quietly, taught me to live decently, so I wouldn't grow up with hatred. I folded the folder carefully, placed it back into its cover, then locked it in the safe, not to hide it, but to keep it, because what was inside was not only proof of betrayal, but also a silent vow from someone who sacrificed everything so I could be myself. That night I looked up at the ceiling, no longer angry, only a deep stillness like the sea, where I understood the past could not be erased, but I could write the rest of the story. 3 weeks after the last meeting with Jacob and Deborah, I received a thick envelope from their lawyer's office. The cream-colored envelope was sent by express delivery, marked "Urgent" in the upper left corner. I held it up, already knowing what was inside without opening it. When I flipped to the first page, I laughed. Not from surprise, but from the brazenness of the bold letters. Request for division of joint property, including the house located at defendant, Samara Collins. They were suing me. They really thought I would sit quietly in the house Grandma left me and let them rewrite everything as if I had never been abandoned on the road. In the complaint, their lawyer wrote that I intentionally prevented the parents from accessing jointly owned property, that I exploited the situation to occupy the house, and that they hope to resolve peacefully, but have been refused dialogue by the defendant. I folded the paper, placed it gently on the table, exhaled deeply, and picked up the phone. If they wanted to start a war, I wouldn't just defend, I would fight back. With everything they thought I didn't know. I called Nora Sanchez, my close friend from college, now a lawyer specializing in real estate and civil disputes. I sent her all of my grandmother's files, along with newly found documents from court archives and hospital reports from years ago. Damn, Nora said over the phone the next day, her voice filled with surprise. You're sitting on a legal arsenal enough to crush all their claims. Then let's get started, I replied calmly, though deep inside, a current had been waiting to break free for a long time. We redrafted the entire counterclaim, attaching clear evidence, copies of the police report from 2004 at the gas station, the legal guardianship petition my grandmother filed, with photos and witness statements, security footage from the gas station surveillance cameras, archived by the court. I had a former court clerk help retrieve it from the image archives. Deborah's psychological treatment certificate from Silver Pine Medical Center, diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, information sealed in civil documents, but accessible during property disputes. I sat with Nora in her small office in the city's West Commercial District, typing every line of the legal response. Nora shook her head with a smile when I read the conclusion. This defendant, Miss Samara Collins, does not deny access to the property. The defendant only refuses the return of those who abandoned her when she was under 10 years old and now seek to reclaim what they once tried to take by suing her own biological mother. She said, I wish every judge could hear this in your voice. I replied, I will say it if needed. The following week, we filed the counterclaim with the county court. Just a few days later, Jacob's side immediately submitted a request for mediation. A clear sign they hadn't expected me to have so much evidence. But I refused any private meetings. Everything had to happen in public, with records and witnesses. While waiting for the hearing, Nora discovered an important detail. In 2006, Jacob had signed a voluntary agreement to relinquish any property rights to my grandmother's house in exchange for $5,000 she directly transferred, a small document lost in old bank files. Although it hadn't been publicly notarized, the bank's transaction certification was enough to impact the entire case. I lived normally in that house, but every day as I walked down the hall, stepped into the kitchen, or looked up at my grandmother's small altar, I felt she was there, watching, supporting, and waiting for me to finish what she once felt powerless to complete. I was no longer the granddaughter curled behind the lawyer's chair, holding her trembling hand during court. I would stand tall, look straight at those who chose to leave, and force them to face what they tried to forget. The trial opened on a Monday morning in courtroom number 3 at Cook County Courthouse. I arrived early, wearing a light gray suit, my hair neatly pulled back, no makeup, just myself, clear and focused. Nora was beside me, carrying an old leather briefcase, worn at the edges but containing all the evidence needed to overturn the opposition's arguments. I saw her. Across the courtroom, Jacob and Deborah sat close together, both dressed formally, faces somber. Deborah even wore a black hat, as if attending a funeral. They didn't look at me. That was fine. I didn't need pitying or regretful looks staged to impress the judge. The trial began with the plaintiff's lawyer's statement. A short, gray-haired man, stocky but with a voice full of experience. He argued that Jacob was the legal co-owner of the house since 1996, that his client had been pushed out of the family due to psychological circumstances, and grieving the loss of his wife. Deborah was just the wife, never intending to seize anything, and now they only wanted a small portion to stabilize their final years. Nora sat quietly, occasionally tilting her head to jot notes. I watched silently. When the other side began describing the father-child relationship needing healing, Jacob bowed his head, his shoulders trembling as if holding back tears. Deborah raised a tissue to her face, sighing dramatically. The judge turned to me and asked, Ms. Collins, do you have any response to what has been presented? I nodded. Nora stood and walked to the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, the defendant does not deny that Mr. Jacob Collins was once listed as co-owner of the house, but only formally without fulfilling any maintenance, financial contributions, or care for over 2 decades. The defendant also presents evidence showing he abandoned ownership through an unofficial transfer with confidentiality terms. The judge nodded slightly. Nora produced the 2006 agreement copy, along with my grandmother's bank statement showing direct payments to Jacob, signed as received, with a clear note. All property rights transferred to my mother as of this date. Not stopping there, Nora played a recording. The audio was faint but audible. My grandmother's deep voice saying, "And if you intend to mortgage this house to gamble again, don't expect any more help from me. I've paid your tuition, your wife's credit card debts, and now you want to sell the house too?" Jacob's voice followed, nearly a whisper. "Just temporarily, Mom. When I win back, I'll repay." No one in the courtroom spoke. Jacob sat silent. Deborah turned away, lips pressed tight. The judge laid her hand on the file stack and asked directly, "Mr. Jacob Collins, do you deny that the voice in this recording is yours?" Jacob looked up, eyes lost. He seemed to want to say something, but only shook his head quietly, unable to speak. Nora continued, citing a psychological report from 2002, confirming Deborah had been treated at Silver Pine Medical Center with a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder and refused further treatment due to non-cooperation. This information wasn't to attack personally, but served as evidence that Deborah was unfit to participate in any property management rights. After reviewing all documents, hearing arguments, and examining evidence, the judge asked both parties to stand. "Based on the documents and evidence presented," she said, slowly scanning from me to them, "the court rules. Mr. Jacob Collins and Mrs. Deborah Collins hold no legal ownership rights to any portion of the property located at in the city of Chicago. Full management and ownership rights are transferred to Miss Samara Collins." I stood silently, my arms relaxed by my side, but inside, my heart felt like it had just taken its first deep breath after years of suppression. "The court also issues a 10-year restraining order," she continued, "applicable to both Mr. Jacob Collins and Mrs. Deborah Collins against Miss Samara Collins, including her residence and workplace. This order is effective immediately." Jacob lowered his head. Deborah stood straight, her gaze still cold, but this time it was the cold of someone defeated, with no way to retreat. I walked out of the courtroom with Nora by my side. The sky outside was clearer, gentle sunlight falling on the street. I felt no joy or excitement, only an unusual calm, as if the layers of anger and hurt had been peeled away, restoring my right to live a life no longer overshadowed by others. The call came that evening as I was about to lock the front door to take a walk around the neighborhood. The phone screen showed an unfamiliar number, no saved name. I stood still for a moment, fingers hesitating between answering or ignoring. Then I pressed answer and brought the phone to my ear. His voice came through, hoarse and hesitant, as if he had endured a long, sleepless day. "Samira." I didn't respond, only silently listening to his breath on the other end. "It's been a day since the trial. I know there's nothing left to say, but I still want you to know." For the first time in many years, I heard him call himself Dad. The word sounded foreign, as if borrowed temporarily, attached to this conversation not by affection, but by late regret. I didn't think things would turn out this way. I just thought, if you'd listen, if you gave us a chance, maybe— He paused, voice breaking. "We could reconnect. Even just a little. We're still family, Samara. No matter how angry you are. That can't be undone. Please, don't act like nothing ever happened between us." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. Not because I was moved, but because I felt pity. Not for me, but for him, a man who spent his whole youth trading trust, now trying to mend the broken pieces with a fragile thread of blood. I answered calmly, not cold, but absolutely clear. Blood doesn't erase the choices adults make, Mr. Collins. When I was 9, you taught me that lesson. Silence on the other end. I don't need to say more. No need to retell the story of that gas station. No need to mention the cold chicken soup I ate alone on my first night at Grandma's house. No need to emphasize the years I grew up without a single check-in, without a birthday card, without even one visit from him. I hung up the phone, gently. No slam, no trembling hands, not a single tear. The phone fell silent as if it had never rung. I placed it on the table and stepped out to the porch. A soft breeze carried the scent of blooming lilacs along the fence. Streetlights cast gentle pools of light on the road, soft, unassuming, unpretentious. I walked down the familiar street, the very path where Grandma used to hold my hand, guiding me with small steps to keep my balance. She always said, "Walk steady, dear. Winds may change, people may change, but your feet must know where you're going." I've never forgotten those words. It's not blood or titles that defined who people are in my life. It's how they choose to stand by me or leave me when I need them most. And sometimes maturity doesn't come from forgiveness, but from the ability to face pain and say, "I will not step backward." I kept walking, my heart lighter than my feet touching the cool pavement. Above, clouds drifted apart, revealing a scattering of stars. Enough to know the night was still here, but enough to believe dawn would come. I began renovating Grandma's house just 1 week after the final court hearing, not to forget, but to preserve what deserved keeping. Love, beautiful memories, and a silent promise to the woman who raised me. The kitchen, once filled with the smell of apple pie, was transformed into a cozy common room, with warm lighting, honey-colored wooden chairs, and small bookshelves stocked with children's stories. My old bedroom became a playroom for kids, the walls painted a soft green, decorated with drawings the children colored with crayons. I named the new home the Olive Nest. My grandmother once told me that in Italy, olive trees survive the longest droughts because their roots dig deep into the earth. I wanted this place to be the rooted home for children who, like me, once wandered lost. Our first program partnered with the city's children's hospital to welcome kids awaiting foster care placement who had nowhere temporary to stay. I don't call it a shelter or a temporary home, but a transition from confusion to stability, from fear to hope. At first, there were only 3 kids. A quiet 5-year-old boy who always hugged a pillow. A dark-skinned boy who liked to sit on the porch hugging his knees, listening to music on old headphones, and an 8-year-old black-hailed girl named Lacey, with a faint scar under her chin, who always looked down whenever strangers came near. I got used to waking early to make breakfast for the house, reading stories to the kids at nap time, and sitting down to help with math homework after dinner. Not every day was smooth. Some nights Lacey would scream from nightmares about her mother locking her in a dark room. Other times the little boy angrily tore down all the wall art because someone had eaten his cookies. But in those moments, I'd sit beside them, not press questions, not lecture, just listen. One Friday afternoon, as I folded laundry in the utility room, Lacey tiptoed in, holding a teddy bear with a red thread sewn around its ear. "Miss Samara," she whispered. I turned and smiled gently. "Yes, I'm here." Lacey was quiet for a moment, then looked up. Her brown eyes were both shy and curious. "Have you ever been abandoned?" The question didn't clash in the room, but it touched something deep inside me. I knelt down, placed my hand on her shoulder, and looked straight into her eyes. Eyes so much like mine at 9 years old. "Yes," I answered softly, steady. "I once stood alone in an empty parking lot, holding a bottle of water, not knowing where to go, but someone found me and brought me home. And now, you and we both have a place to call home." Lacey pressed her lips together and nodded. She sat down beside me, saying nothing more, letting the teddy bear rest in my hands as if we had just signed a quiet pact without words. That night, after the kids were asleep, I stepped onto the back porch where Grandma once planted a maple tree. Under the yellow light, I saw the first red leaves signaling fall's arrival. A gentle breeze stirred the porch wind chime. I sat on the steps, hands resting on the cool wood, feeling the strength of the house I had grown up in, full of sorrow once, now a place of hope and healing. I don't know how many more children will come through these doors, maybe one, maybe 10, but one thing I know for sure, no one will ever be left behind in this house again, not a single one. Each of us carries our own story about family, wounds, and those quiet moments of rising again. Maybe you've never been abandoned on a roadside like me, but have you ever felt cast aside in your own home? Have you ever had to learn to love yourself again after those you trusted hurt you? I really want to hear your thoughts after listening to this story. What do you think is most important for a child to grow up not only safe, but strong? Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, because maybe your story will touch the heart of someone quietly suffering, just like I once did. And if you're interested in real-life stories, subtle slices of family, forgiveness, and the choice to rise and live proudly, please subscribe to the channel, because there are many more stories waiting to be told, and maybe, just maybe, one of them is your own.